So once we have understood, what do we mean by unsupervised approaches and what's exactly clustering and how could it be applied to real life scenarios, let's look into the different methods. As I mentioned before, we're going to start with partitional clustering. For each of the different types of clustering, we're going to be looking into methods to actually implement those types of clustering. And we'll also be looking into what are, the problems of this type of clustering techniques. Okay, so let's start. Partitional clustering, is one of the simplest ways of dividing points that you could think of, right? Imagine that we have the input data on the left-hand side, and basically on the right-hand side could be a potential partitional clustering. The way partitional clustering works, let's say the general idea behind partitional clustering is that we tend to put together dots that are or that look together, okay, that they are closer to each other. Okay, and those points that are not closer to each other basically are going to be from a different cluster. That's the intuition behind it. Partitional clustering, we say that it's a center-based method. So basically we have a cluster. In partitional clustering, a cluster is just defined as a set of objects, okay, such that whenever we have an object within a cluster, it's simply because that object is closer to the center of the cluster than to the center of any other cluster in the set of in the data set that we have. Okay, so basically for each of the clusters we define a centroid, that's the center of the cluster, and we can assure that any single point that is within that cluster is going to be closer to the centroid than to any other centroid of any other clusters that we might have. In partitional clustering, the number of clusters has to be identified. Okay, that's one of the main drawbacks that we have, because oftentimes we don't know how many clusters we need to identify. One of the most common partitional methods is k-means. Okay, so k-means, as I was saying, we need to identify the k clusters. So k is predefined. Typically what we do is that we explore different numbers of k, and then there are measures that allow us to select the best value of k. Once we have selected the number of clusters that we want to identify, we basically the initialization process just specifies the initial cluster centers. These are, these do not need to be points in the dataset. Okay, we'll see another partitional method that requires the points to always be points in the dataset. Okay, k-means does not require points to be does not require centers to be points of the dataset. It can just be an average, and as we'll see in a moment. And then basically what k-means does is that it iterates for each object. It calculates the distance between the object and all the centroids that we have, and then basically assigns the object to the cluster whose centroid is the closest. Okay, and then once this has been done, all the objects have been assigned to their own clusters. We basically recompute the centroid and repeat the iteration until basically no change appears. So no objects change from one cluster to another one. Let's see this visually because it's probably going to be easier, right? So we start with an initialization process where we identify the three cluster centroids, the three centroids, which again do not need to be points in the dataset, okay? And in fact, they are just randomly selected within the limits of the points that we have. The next thing that we do is that we assign each object to its closest centroid. So in this case, M1, all the green points have been assigned to M1 because in fact they are closer to M1. All the red points have been assigned to M2, and all the pink points have been assigned to M3 because they are closest to M3. Once we have done that, these are our three clusters, right? Again, k has to be pre-specified. So in this case, we decided to work with k equals 3. And these are the three clusters that we have. Now the next thing, we need to recompute the centroid. So the centroid is recomputed literally as the average of all the points that are part of that cluster. So as you can imagine, because we have so many points on the right hand side, for example, for cluster number 1, for M1, so M1 is going to be displaced more towards the right because that's where the middle of all the points, the average of all the points is going to fall. M2 is also recomputed, and M3 are also recomputed. After recomputation, these are the centroids of the clusters that we have. Okay, M1, M3, and M2. So now what we do is again start the whole process again, right? And for each object, compute their distance to each of the centroids and see whether we have to actually change any sample to another cluster. And basically, if you compare this one with this one, you see that, for example, the red point in the, basically the x-axis is 1, the y-axis is 4, okay? In the 1, 4, that green point there changes to red, basically because we recompute the distance from that point to M1 and M2, and it turns out that the distance is shortest to M2, so that point is reassigned to cluster number 2, okay? And basically, again, we recompute the centroid, and once the centroid is recomputed, for each object, again, we compute the distance from each object to each M1, M2, M3 centroid, and whenever we see that that point is closer to another centroid, we basically reassign that object to a cluster, okay, to the closest cluster. Now, the process is repeated here, and again, I mean, in this case, none of the objects are changed of cluster, so they remain in the same cluster, and so we are done, okay? But remember, I mean, we start with a set of centroids, then we assign objects to the closest centroid, recompute centroids, and basically repeat that process until no object is changed from one cluster to another one. The selection, in fact, I mean, so the centroids are chosen randomly, but the selection of centroids might, in fact, impact the final clusters, right? So imagine, for example, we start with these iterations. They're not super visible, but there's a cross here, and across here, okay? So imagine that we have these points, and we start with these 3 crosses here, which are our centroids, right? And we basically iterate through the algorithm. This is the final result. Whereas this is the final result that you see. It makes sense because we have, 3 differentiated clusters. But if we start, imagine that we take this other scenario, in which basically the crosses that we assign are much different. So here now we have 1 cross here, 1 cross here, right? So basically the assignment of crosses, and the third cross is down here in the red cluster, right? We have 2 here and 1 down here. So basically with this other selection of centroids, we end up with, in iteration 5, we end up with that separation of dots that does not look as good as, the previous iteration. So in fact, where we locate the initial centroids plays a role, okay, and it might impact the quality of the clustering. So typically, the way we solve this when we run k-means is that we execute multiple runs. So in fact, whenever you report k-means results, you need to report average results after running it at least between, say, 50 and 100 times. Okay, so what we do is that we run the clustering algorithm multiple times. We report accuracy, and then basically the accuracy is just the average accuracy across all 100 runs or whatever, okay? If we have labels to, compute accuracy. If we don't have labels to compute accuracy, basically we'll use the Davis-Baldwin measure. What it measures is basically the distance between the points within a cluster and the distance between clusters. Okay, so as you can imagine, whenever we are clustering, we want our algorithm to put together the points in such a way that the intra-cluster distance are minimized, but the inter-cluster distances are maximized. Okay, so we want the points to be really, really, really densely put together into a cluster, but we also want the clusters to be as separated as possible. That's the Davis-Baldwin index. And that's an index that we use, for example, whenever we are clustering and we don't have any type of labels to check classification results. Whenever we are clustering, we can compute the Davis-Baldwin index for different k values and then basically check or select the k value that gives the best DB index. One actually critical problem in k-means is the fact that it's really sensitive to outliers. Okay, so if we have a situation like, for example, the one that you see here, obviously the dot that is signed as an outlier, it's forcing the algorithm to create a cluster with just 2 data points, whereas the natural thing would be to cluster the red ones in one cluster and the blue ones in another one, right? But that's not happening because of the outlier. So there are techniques that allow us to solve a little bit, the outlier issue. And in this case is the K-Madoids method, which is again another partitional method. But in this case, the main difference is that the centers of the clusters are always points, original points in our dataset. Okay, so that's the reason why it's slightly more robust than K-means whenever we have an outlier, because it's not as much influenced by those values. Why? Because again, we are always taking the centroid as being a point in the data set, so chances are that that will be within a high density region. But the only difference is that one, right? And the process is exactly the same thing. So what I'm showing here is it's called partitioning around method. It's the PAM algorithm, which is exactly the same to k-means. But the only difference, as you can see here, we have the loop until no points are reassigned. The only difference is that the centers that we keep choosing at every iteration in the loop are always data points in our data set. There are three important limitations in k-means and in general in partitioning algorithms. The first one is different sizes. Okay, so whenever we have clusters that are going to have different sizes, like for example the original points on the left hand side, imagining that we had the labels and we knew the real distribution is the blue squares, the red dots, and the green triangles. And on the right hand side we have the three clusters that we have obtained with k-means. As you can see, k-means works really well when the sizes of the clusters are different. Okay, I mean, you observe that k-means tend to generate actually clusters with similar number of samples. That's wrong. Differing densities. Whenever we have on the left hand side are the original points, the original classes. Whenever we have classes that are highly dense, like for example the blue squares or the green triangles, that's really hard for k-means to detect. And so on the right hand side you see what the final clusters are when we have used the three centroids with the black cross there. So basically, k-means identifies the two dense areas. It's just one unique cluster, and then the lower density area, it divides it into two clusters that have no meaning whatsoever. And k-means also works really bad when we have irregular shapes. So the original points that are on the left-hand side, these are the two classes that we have. And on the right-hand side, we have, a completely wrong separation that k-means has done, right? So what do we do? I mean, so basically for, different sizes, different densities, and irregular shapes, there's little we can do with k-means.